Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Reckon Interview Live. I'm John Hammontree, and today we are talking with our friend Ian Sams, who is a Democratic strategist. He's worked with the Kamala Harris campaign, Hillary Clinton campaign, Tim Kaine Senate campaigns. He's worked for the DNC, longtime Politico, but also a good friend of mine from college, and UA graduate and an Appalachian native. Ian, thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We've heard a lot this week of politicians call the DNC an unconventional convention. How do you think everything's gone the first few nights?
It's definitely unconventional. I don't envy the people who've had to put it together. Being forced to sort of rewrite the entire typical playbook over the course of 1 week in a pandemic is not an enviable task. I'm sure the Trump people are thinking about the same things next week. For him, they just apparently don't care about things like laws and are deciding to have it at the White House instead of at a neutral site not paid for by taxpayers. But look, I think the DNC stuff has been pretty good so far. I mean, it's interesting to see them trying to innovate and do different types of content that might be more engaging for regular people. Like, I don't know a ton of regular people who really want to sit and watch a 45-minute speech to a lecture hall or to a convention hall on TV. I think it's more likely that regular people across the country would see a 4-minute video that a leader records or does live to tape that then can live on social media for days and weeks to come. Like Michelle Obama's speech, I think one of the ways that it was so effective was it was so personal and intimate with the viewer, as if she was just talking to you in your living room. And that's the kind of content that I think you want to see live on beyond just an event. And so both the way that they've manufactured speeches to sort of be more intimate and personal in nature, the way that they put together montages that are short and quick and punchy on issue areas of importance.
Plenty of Springsteen.
Yeah, plenty of Springsteen for the old fogies out there. Plenty of Billie Eilish for the young people out there. Even those. I think even like a Billie Eilish performance or a Billy Porter performance. Those things can live online and be interesting and engaging for people and make people kind of interested in a convention or the electoral process in a way that they haven't been before.
Well, I think one thing that you don't get in the typical convention hall conventions is the kind of scale of the party. And I'm sure we'll see this on the Republican side too next week, but particularly during the roll call, seeing people from every state, kind of chime in from where they are. Here in Alabama, Terry Sewell doing it from Edmund Pettus Bridge. You wouldn't get those moments otherwise, I don't think.
Yeah, totally. And you're able to spotlight people kind of where they are. And it's interesting. At the end of the day, I'm not, I think that everybody in my line of work wrestles with how impactful and important things like this really are anyway. I don't know to the degree to which regular people really care that much about a convention a week in the summertime, especially now in the modern era when I think a lot of the impact of what they historically have done is gone because we know that Joe Biden's going to be the nominee. We know Kamala Harris is going to be the nominee. A lot of the party business that gets done at conventions, sort of a foregone conclusion now. And so, I think trying to figure out ways to make it engaging and interesting content is sort of the future of how these are going to go, as opposed to just having a party for the sake of having a party in a city somewhere that, political operatives and delegates and elected officials and journalists might really enjoy and have a lot of fun at, but most Americans don't really understand or engage with. So, I think it's really been a good, of course it's been out of necessity. I think that everybody wishes that we didn't have to do this because of a pandemic, but I think it's been good that there's been some innovation in the space, so to speak, to try to get, these to be a little bit more interesting for people than just sort of the traditional rote party convention.
I do want to remind everybody who's watching, this is an interactive show. If you have questions for Ian, please leave them in the comments. We'll try to address them as best we can. Ian, you worked on Kamala Harris's campaign when she was running for the Democratic nomination. She wound up dropping out before we reached most of the southern states. So we never really got to see how she played in South Carolina, how she would have played in the SEC primary. what did your internals suggest about the impact that she could have on Biden's chances in southern states in November?
Yeah, I mean, the primary was obviously difficult. It was a historically large field. Vice President Biden sort of had a lock on a lot of key constituency groups that ultimately led him to victory, but also I think were people who, in another race without him in the field, might have gravitated towards Senator Harris, thinking suburban women, African Americans, older voters, people who may have gravitated toward her and her message a little bit more had he not been a massive figure in the race and sort of keeping that support all throughout the primary. So it's kind of hard to look at the sort of horse race dynamic of the primary and analogize it to now, but you can think about how the very appeal that I just talked about, the types of voters that she was appealing to in the primary, how that could maybe expand and help the ticket in November. You think about, state like Alabama, states like Georgia, North Carolina, growing suburban college educated populations where politics are changing a little bit. People have been drifting more toward Democrats in recent years, especially as those suburban communities have diversified. You have, more active engagement and participation among younger voters in these states, especially in urban centers and urban counties. I think all of those things combine. Obviously, I mean the demographic that carried Joe Biden to the nomination, where Kamala has a lot of appeal as well, as African Americans, especially African American women. We saw the power of that voting bloc in Alabama in Doug Jones's race, which really put him over the top and allowed him to shock the world with Democratic victory in Alabama. So, I wouldn't think of it so much as necessarily geographic, but demographic where those people live. And so, you can imagine in a state, Alabama is not a swing state in the presidential election, but Georgia and North Carolina and even Texas and certainly Florida are. Florida is a little bit of a weirder dynamic, not as true sort of a southern state. I know I'm going to offend Gator fans everywhere with that, but Georgia and North Carolina specifically, you think about the dynamics at play in those states, and you can easily see her being an asset to strengthen Joe Biden's standing among suburban voters, college students, Black voters, Latino voters, really the core groups that make up the new Democratic coalition in 2020. And then you think about a state like South Carolina, where if you go back to 2008, I want to say that Barack Obama only lost South Carolina to John McCain by 8 points. I think it was a single-digit contest, which is kind of crazy to think about because I think everybody thinks of South Carolina as a really red state. But you think about now we have Jamie Harrison, who's launched a very, very credible Senate challenge to Lindsey Graham. And you think about him being, an African-American man at the top of the state ticket as a Senate candidate. And you think about Kamala Harris being on the national ticket as a vice president. The energy and enthusiasm that could generate for just core Democratic base voters to turn out and vote, while also drawing in that appeal from sort of your swingy, college educated, white, suburban type voters, it really could be in a pretty incredible dynamic that helps either not just the ticket Biden Harris win some of these southern states that are swing states, but also could help a candidate like Jamie Harrison in a South Carolina, or a John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock in Georgia, or Doug Jones in Alabama, kind of get the enthusiasm that they need on the Democratic side to be competitive in states where they otherwise in a normal kind of year wouldn't.
Well, let's talk about the inverse of that, I guess. This week on the Rick and Interview podcast, we talked a lot about the Southern strategy and how over the last 4 decades, the Republican Party has kind of retooled itself to go after white Southern voters, particularly on issues of race, anti-feminism, and religion. One of the things that we had seen over the summer is that the Trump campaign and the Republican Party were having a really hard time kind of defining Joe Biden as somebody who was going to mobilize the base. Maybe in part because he is a white man, and that is something that the party is not built to combat against. But the party has plenty of experience over the last 3 cycles of using some anti-women attacks on a candidate like Hillary Clinton, whose campaign you worked on in 2016, or using some race baiting attacks on a candidate like Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. What have you learned from working on some of these campaigns about how Kamala Harris maybe pushes back on some of that, or will that be as effective in 2020 in the wake of Black Lives Matter, in the wake of the Me Too movement, in the wake of the women's marches?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think that we can pretend like it's going to go away. I mean, I think that, like what you mentioned, this has been sort of part of their tried and true strategy over the last 15 years, basically since Barack Obama came onto the scene as a party to gin up division, gin up racial resentment, gender-based resentment. And I think they're going to try to do that. We've already seen in the last week since Kamala was announced as the running mate, the president entertaining birtherism again with her, his allies sort of doing it even more frontally and aggressively, and him not shooting it down. You see him using, tropes that she's angry or, nasty, these sorts of things that are the exact same, the exact same lines that he used against Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. The thing about it, though, that's different is that this is not 2016, and this is not Hillary Clinton, and this is not President Obama, although I'll note President Obama was elected twice as president. So, like, there is a ceiling to the effectiveness of some of these attacks. But, I think that what's been striking over the last week is that they really don't seem to have a grip on what their central attack on Kamala is going to be. It matches, like you mentioned a minute ago, their inability to sort of define Biden over the last 6 months and trying every brand and attack in the book, and none of it really sticking. I actually think that the voter is a little bit tired of that sort of behavior. I think, especially with Trump as an incumbent, I think it's easier when he's a challenger to Hillary Clinton in 2016, and Hillary was sort of seen as an avatar of the current establishment, and Barack Obama was the president of the United States. It was easier for Trump to be an outsider who kicked up a lot of dirt and raised a lot of hell in the process. I think that now that he's president, especially compounded by the fact that we're in this pandemic that he is very clearly messed up, and an economic downturn that he has very clearly exacerbated, and a moment of sort of racial reckoning that has been a long time coming, and he has very seriously mishandled and probably deepen and fan the flames of division on. I think all those things pile up to have voters who matter, let me put it that way, swing voters, people who are persuadable, gettable voters for Trump that are also gettable voters for Biden. I think those people aren't interested in hearing some of the sexist, racist attacks that, he's trotted out before. His base is going to love it. And the far right sort of white nationalist base that has, really animated under Trump and the Republican Party, I think they love to see it, but you're preaching to the choir, and any successful campaign is sort of a politics of addition and not a politics of subtraction. And so it's hard for him to make that case successfly with college-educated women, for example, which is, a demographic that swung for Trump in 2016, but I think are really abandoning him and don't really want to hear sort of racist, sexist tropes against a historic nominee in an election that's happening in this environment.
Let's talk a little bit about how the Democratic strategy is changing in the South. We know what the Republican strategy has been up until this point, and perhaps if they lose in 2020, they will have to reevaluate that strategy. But, for most of our lifetimes, certainly after the 90s, it seemed like the Democrats either took the South for granted on the state level or abandoned it on the national level. And so you have worked on campaigns in Virginia, which will count as a Southern state. You grew up in Tennessee, you lived in Alabama, have lived in Alabama, I should say. It seems like the Democrats are highlighting more Southern candidates than I can remember. Of the 17 in the keynote, 8, I think, represented Southern states. We saw, Stacey Abrams speaking from Georgia. We obviously heard from 2 past Democratic Southern presidents, Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter. And Sally Yates, I think, spoke from Atlanta as well. It seems, and that may just be my sensibilities keying in on it, but it seems like Democrats are starting to recognize, demographically, Georgia may be more of a swing state in the future than Ohio.
Yeah.
North Carolina may be more of a swing state than Wisconsin. How effective do you think that strategy is going to be? And do you think it happens in 2020, or are we still a few cycles out?
I think it happens some places in 2020, and I think that in other places it's a little bit longer of a time horizon. The populations are changing, and therefore the politics will change. It's not that somehow the politics are suddenly, changing the way that people think about this stuff. There's a little bit of an effect of that, but I think that largely you see the diversification and the growing populations in southern states really changing the nature and dynamics of politics in those states. And, that's a little bit different in a state like Alabama. You look at Doug Jones beating Roy Moore. That was probably more the product of Roy Moore being a colossally disastrous candidate who was embarrassing on every front for even any respectable Republican. And Doug Jones hitting, everything at 100% that a Democrat needs to do in the state, and Roy Moore underperforming, President Trump by half or whatever it was. That's a different dynamic at play. But if you look at a state like North Carolina and Georgia and Texas, the model that's happening in those three states is very similar to a state like Virginia, where I've done a couple campaigns. And Virginia 10 years ago, every statewide elected official at the state level, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, were all Republicans. They haven't won a race since 2009. And why is that? It's because there's a high educated, highly diverse population growing in Northern Virginia and in the suburbs areas around Richmond. And there's still plenty of Republicans in the state. You think about the rural Appalachian Mountains, you think about the rural southern part of Virginia, north of the North Carolina border, which historically was farmland. There are still the same amount of Republican voters in the state, but the number of voters who are lean or are Democrat just continue to grow. And that's fundamentally altered the politics of that state. And you see the same thing happening in North Carolina with the Research Triangle and the growth of Charlotte. You see it happening in Atlanta with the growth, or in Georgia with the growth of Atlanta and the suburbs there. Even in Tennessee and Alabama, you see Nashville exploding. You see Birmingham and Huntsville growing with highly educated and younger populations. There are changes that are going to happen that will affect politics in a state. Whether it happens in 2020 or not is an open question. I think that it's likely that we'll see North Carolina or Georgia go blue this cycle. I think it's likelier that we see them elect maybe 2 Democratic senators from those states. And that's because of the kind of cocktail of problems that are happening right now in the country, and Donald Trump being president, and the way that he has driven a lot of historically Republican voters away from the party. But I don't think that it's something that happens overnight. And it's especially more complicated when you think about gerrymandering in the way that congressional districts across southern states have been retooled and reworked. And obviously in 2021, we're going to have redistricting and across all these states where, if the maps get redrawn differently, you could see more opportunities for Democrats to be successful in these states going forward. So it's just an interesting trend. I think that the old Democratic strengths in these southern states were largely white, largely rural, largely working class, while piggybacking on the loyalty and strength of diverse voters, especially Black voters. I think now, the strength and power lies in Black voters and diverse voters, and college-educated people are sort of along for the ride. And that's kind of how we're deciding whether or not these southern states actually do tip blue.
What is something that you think that maybe the national parties and national pundits, get wrong about the South and get wrong about Southern voters?
It's a good question, and it's a huge challenge. I think national operatives and pundits get a lot of things wrong about a lot of people in a lot of places. They get a lot of things right about a lot of people in a lot of places too. But, I think that the thing about the South is, I think you can be really successful as a Democrat in the South by just being really earnest and authentic in who you are, and not necessarily being an rigid, orthodox, ideological candidate. I think that you're probably more successful in the South as a Democrat by being more sort of retail, charisma, pragmatic kind of candidate. But at the end of the day, I also think that you're probably stronger as a Democrat in the South if you can really strongly appeal and build loyalty among those core diverse coalitions that make up the Democratic base. I don't know. I think for too long, Democratic national operatives wrote off some of these southern states and didn't make the investments that they need to sort of build a bench, understand some of these changing demographics and population trends in key areas. I think that toward the end of the Obama administration, I think people started to realize, wait a second, we don't need to write off some of these southern states anymore. And so I think that there's been a little bit more of a progressive development on the national front, with people seeing states in the South as being competitive. And obviously, you have every now and then these races like Doug Jones's that shock the world and sort of give everybody a different perspective that actually politics is kind of local, and like these states can have really good homegrown Democrats in them that can be successful. They just need the help and the resources to do it. I mean, you look at a state like Louisiana, where John Bel Edwards won the governorship, and we're the Democrats have the governor of Louisiana. He's a conservative Democrat. He's certainly sort of against, is on the other side of the issues on some of the like national party platform positions, but that's okay. I think that we have to sort of be a big tent party and welcome in candidates who sort of meet their states where they are, and not write them off just because they may not agree with sort of Democratic orthodoxy on every issue. And that sort of flexibility, I think, is something that national operatives, especially as like a younger generation of national operatives who come up outside of the old Southern Democratic perspective and are really steeped in and understand, newer diverse coalitions of Democratic, voters in the modern era. I think that that's changing the way that sort of national operatives and pundits think about Southern states and what it takes to win there.
We have a comment from our mutual friend, Will Thomas, who wants to point out that we are his two favorite bald men with clear glasses who graduated from the University of Alabama, specifically from 2010 to 2011. So very narrow demographic.
Yeah, very narrow demographic. Yeah, we are kind of twinning a little bit today.
Yeah, that's all right. Let's talk about the University of Alabama, specifically as it relates to football. If we see football canceled in the next few months, do you think that has an impact on election turnout in the South?
I mean, the New York Times actually just did a really interesting story on this last week, that they went to Ohio and looked at the Big Ten and Ohio State as sort of a case study for how that's going to affect voter behavior in the elections in November. And there were a number of people who were Trump supporters, I think 4 years ago, who were on the record basically saying, I think it's going to hurt him, that like, we may roll our eyes and look past a lot of other things he does, but when we can't have our college football, it's a bridge too far, and so I do think there's going to be some effect of that. I think that people, the more you upend people's routine lives, the more it's going to impact their views on the leadership of the country and state. And so, it'll be interesting to see whether the football season kind of goes forward as we expect it to. I see that the university's already decided they're going to let 20,000 fans into the stadium or whatever to watch home games. If it takes 2 games and suddenly there are coronavirus outbreaks everywhere, that's not going to stand, and it's going to be problematic. I just think you're going to see a lot of anger and frustration among voters as to what's going on, more than you currently see. There's going to be a weird partisan rigidity because we're just a very divided and partisan country right now, that Trump supporters will just bluster their way through it and say that, liberals and universities and the media are taking this too far, and they're not going to let outbreaks and deaths sort of stand in their way of making that case. But, I think there's a lot of people, more people than that, who are reasonable thinkers, who are going to say, man, this is just not working. Like this approach to our country and our problems is just not working, and it's costing us a lot of stuff that we really care about. I mean, you even kind of see that a little bit in Alabama. You think about the way that Kay Ivey has sort of led the coronavirus response in the state. Not been perfect. Sure, she's done a lot of stuff wrong, but has taken a notably different tone than President Trump on masks and social distancing and things like that.
Kemp.
Yeah, or Brian Kemp next door. Yeah, definitely. Or Tate Reeves in Mississippi next door. I think that, she understands that like these are not fake issues that you can just bluster your way through, that you actually have to try to solve them. It's a pandemic. And so, it'll be interesting to see in the football season as sort of an avatar for regional differences, state differences in handling the coronavirus, sort of how it all plays out. And I mean, you're already seeing it, Pac-12 canceling a season, but SEC going forward. It's going to be a really, I think, cultural divide, but I think it's also going to probably cause a lot of people to continue having to think about the pandemic and the toll that it's taken. And any time that people are spending their time thinking about that is probably bad for Donald Trump as president, and then a lot of sitting office holders who are in charge of the response in these states.
Well, Ian, thanks so much for your time. And
hey,
to
glad
those
to
of
do
you
it.
watching, if you want more conversations like this, please subscribe to The Reckon Interview wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next week. Thanks again, Ian.
Yep.